All right, so perhaps many could argue that the COVID-19 pandemic could force change in how we educate future generations. Schools in many countries have been impacted by the outbreak, with educational institutions going into lockdown, including here in South Africa. Schools have begun reopening. So while the impact of this virus will be far-reaching, what does it mean in the longer term for education? Let's chat a bit more about this now. I'm joined by Lebogang Montjane, who is the Executive Director of Independent Schools Association of Southern Africa, ISASA. Elijah Mhlanga, also the spokesperson for the Department of Basic Education. Dr. Gastrow, who is Chief Research Specialist, Education and Skills Development at the Human Sciences Research Council. Gentlemen, a very good evening to you. Thanks indeed for your time.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you so much for having us.
Good evening.
A very good evening to you once again, gentlemen. So, Mr. Mhlanga, let me start with you. I do understand that the department has already started collating the latest figures in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on the country's schools. What do we know so far?
Well, we collect the data every week. The Director General has engagements on a one-on-one basis with all provinces, and each province is requested to gather information and report to the department. And they are indicating that there is some kind of a decline and an increase in the recoveries in terms of the numbers of the number of schools that had confirmed cases, as well as the number of educators as well as learners who had the coronavirus. But we are seeing a downward decline, which is consistent with what is happening around the country.
I want to talk about where we are at the moment, Mr. Mhlanga, before we go to our other guests. I mean, given that schools have already started reopening, are you as a department concerned at all about the quality of teaching and learning in the country's public schools, as some may be concerned about educators rushing through the syllabus?
No, there's no rush through the syllabus. If we're rushing through the syllabus, we would have asked all the grades to come in all at once, and we did not do that. We said grade 7 in primary school must come back to school, and grade 12 at the secondary school level must come back to school. But we also said that those schools that feel they have the ability to deviate and bring in other grades should do so. And it's only a small number who have done that. And we said right from the start that it was going to be a phased approach where we do it slowly and gradually. And in that process, we had a trimmed curriculum as well, and we also revised the school calendar. And all of those things were done to readjust the schedule so that we are able to fit in what we have to do with the time that we've got at the moment.
Mr. Mhlanga, I'll come back to that, and perhaps what others have been saying was perhaps some pressure on some of the educators that are still within the school system at the moment. Mr. Montjane, let me bring you in. Independent schools were not exempt. Do we know what the impact has been from your part?
The greatest impact, I think, for us has been our ability to open up under COVID-19 conditions. But what we have been able to do is continue with teaching and learning remotely. And even those schools that have opened, not 100% of pupils are back. So online learning and blended learning is part and parcel of everything that we're doing at the moment. And obviously there have been cases of COVID-19 positive cases. In those instances, portions of schools have closed. But we did have one school in KwaZulu-Natal that decided to go back to remote learning entirely, because they had a series of about 4 teachers testing positive.
I want to bring in Dr. Gastrow. Dr. Gastrow, I hope you can hear me. I mean, there are still major inequalities between public and private schoolings, the system itself, which was exposed by COVID-19. For example, challenges in the digital divide. I can hear Mr. Montjane talk about online learning, the digital divide, online access for some in the public versus those in the private schooling system is still very different. What has this pandemic showed us about the disparities in the two?
It has been very revealing by putting the system under pressure. It has acted as a catalyst for technological changes that have been with us for some time but accelerated. And it's deepened the meaning of the digital divide, which existed before, which separated learners with access to the internet and schools from access to the internet from those that did not. And that's a fundamental difference in your access to knowledge and your prospects for learning and for the path that you'll follow in life. And to me, it's one of the biggest challenges in this country in terms of inequality. And it's one of the biggest challenges in terms of education, and one of the biggest challenges in terms of technology policy and communications policy. And COVID has put that under pressure because, in addition to all the previous dynamics, if children are not able to go to school, if there are lives at stake in that calculation that is made, if they do not have access to the internet, if they don't have the technology and the data, and if they don't have the capability for digitalizing their education, then those children will not get an education, and it perpetuates inequalities in the system. The private or the privileged school system is connected, has the capabilities, and has the data, and will have fundamentally different outcomes to the schools of the not privileged, where in many cases they do not access, or the families of those learners can't afford the data that they need to connect into their school, which in turn brings us to the question of data pricing in South Africa. And I think that discussion really needs to be raised on the agenda if we're going to have a meaningful discussion about education prospects throughout this COVID period in which we live, and also beyond that.
Mr. Mhlanga, let me bring you in exactly there. It is, one would say, correct that there have been many complaints about, the exposure during this period of COVID in terms of the disparities between the public and private schooling system in South Africa. How do you as a department plan to deal with some of those issues? I know there have also been complaints where some of the teachers have said that there's a lot of exerted pressure on them because of those who've also been absent because of comorbidities. How is the department also handling that aspect of online learning, where it seems like you have those within the independent schooling system which are much better off?
Well, as a department, we have worked with the relevant the Department for Communication and Digital Technologies, and we have been able to reach out to the telecommunications companies who have worked with us. We have been able to zero rate more than 300 platforms, websites and apps, as such resources that are now available with quality curriculum content that our learners and our teachers can access, whether they have data on their devices or not. And that to us is a major development which we need to welcome. And we urge our learners and our teachers to explore all these platforms and see what's on it that they can use, because it's there, it's available, and they can access it at any time that they want. But we've gone further to partner with broadcasters. In fact, there will be a launch of a significant development initiative next week for learner support, together with the SABC, ETV, MultiChoice, and other broadcasters who have come on board, having realized the need to support learners. They've come on board to say, here are our resources, this is the role that we want to play. All of those things are being done to try to bridge the gap that we're talking about insofar as ICT is concerned. But when it comes to teachers, yes, we have seen about 25,000 teachers out of 400,000 teachers who have applied to work from home because they've got medical conditions that will pose danger to them. But the departments in the country, in provinces, have worked very hard to recruit teacher assistants and temporary teachers who are going to fill those posts to make sure that there's no disturbance or delay in teaching and learning in schools as we prepare for the 24th of August. So all of that work is underway. We have worked with our partners. We have worked with all other stakeholders who are giving us some valuable input, which we are incorporating in all the plans making going forward.
And has that happened? I mean, how many of these teachers have been recruited? Because the reason why I asked this question, Mr. Mhlanga, is that there had been some concerns from some of these teachers who are back at schools, that some of the pressure that has been put on them as a result of their colleagues who are at home because of these comorbidities, there is exerted pressure on them. How many then have been brought into the schooling system?
Well, there shouldn't be pressure as yet, because not all the learners are back in school. It's just one grade that is in school at the moment, which means the other teachers that teach the other grades are still available to assist. So the full impact will be felt from the 24th of August onwards. So any pressure that is there, it shouldn't be there. Where such is taking place, it should be dealt with within this week already. Because it cannot be allowed that someone already feels the pressure when there has been planning that has been coming on, which is aimed at making sure that no learner is left behind, no classroom is left without a teacher. So all of that is done. In fact, a month ago or so, we put out an advert to invite educated and qualified and unemployed educators to apply for teaching posts where these are available. And in a space of a week or two, we had 10,000 applications. So there's a lot of interest in coming through to the system to fill in those posts and bridge the gap that could exist as a result of those that will be working from home. So we have planned for all those eventualities. Even today, the DG met 3 provinces who have tabled their plans on how this matter is going to be addressed, and other provinces will be reporting tomorrow and Friday on how this matter is going to be dealt with. So the plans are there, and provinces are making progress, and we hope that come the 24th, we'll then be able to see the full impact of the plans that have been put in place. Okay. And if there are adjustments that need to be made, we will then make them.
Mr. Mhlanga, I want to go to our 2 other guests just very shortly, but I have to ask you, can government accommodate learners at new schools at this time of the year?
Well, it depends what the circumstances will be, but Montjane will tell you that some of their member schools have since closed down, which means we now have to try find space for those learners who are now displaced and are looking for space in public schools. So we have to make a plan, and we believe that we have an obligation to do that. We can't turn any learner away, especially at this time of the year, especially those that were using CAPS as a curriculum of choice. We should be able to help them because we would know by now where they are in terms of curriculum coverage. So we should be able to do that. And we hope that those parents who are finding themselves in that situation will get the assistance they need if they go to a district office nearest to them.
All right. Mr. Montjane, that was in fact my next question to you about another aspect of the impact. Some independent schools having to shut down. Talk to us a bit about this. Do we have the exact extent in terms of the impact regarding the closure of some of these schools?
Yes, Christelle, can I just ask another question before I do that quickly? I really do think that the difference really in South African education is between fee-paying and non-fee-paying schools. And that's talking about closure as well. Some of our schools actually charge lower fees than public schools. So I think that our category 4 and 5 schools that are able to charge fees and independent schools are able to, in many ways, have many similarities than those who don't pay fees. But what we have seen correctly, I think that Mr. Mhlanga was very right here, is that we are seeing that we have seen school closures, primarily in pre-primary schools, but the vast majority of our members have dealt with it by cutting or freezing salaries across the board. So that has really been what we've had to do as a sector. And even we as a membership organization are not going to be increasing our subscriptions next year because of the difficulties parents are finding in terms of paying fees under a deep recession that is really a global phenomenon at this time.
Dr. Gastrow, let me come to you. I mean, would this then be a good time to reflect on how this, if we can call it a disruptive crisis, can help us redefine what learning should look like in the future?
Definitely. I mean, if you look at the discussions that were already underway prior to this pandemic, there were already trends that I see accelerated by the pandemic. there was already a move towards a diversification of pedagogical modalities, both in post-school and in school. So those create options for us. We have heard of some of them just now, lifelong learning, online learning, online interactive learning, different modalities of adult learning. All of those have a digital component. So we need to think, creatively within a pandemic, how we can use those more effectively. And, we're going to need to develop new capabilities for actually managing that and learn from what we're experiencing. A lot of institutions are shifting their educational they're shifting the education online now, and the capabilities only exist to an extent. Then they learn, they adapt. So all of those things create options for us. Tapping into the social media, children self-learning online, guiding themselves, having the skills needed to do that. All of these things were there before the pandemic, but if schools are going to be closed, if several grades are going to be at home, then those all become absolutely critical rather than just side options.
Dr. Gastrow, just very quickly on this particular aspect, what then can be done to transform the basic education system to accommodate what we've all seen take place during this pandemic?
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that question, I'm afraid. That is a question that's on the table for discussion. I was in a panel session today that reflected for several hours on that. And the complexity of it really, I think it's something where the debate must go on. There's debate about the role of the unions. There is debate about the role of technology. There's debate about the relationships between the institutions and how functional they are. There's debate about school governance. There's debate about how long the school year goes on for, and is that right or wrong? So at the moment, I think it's about paying attention to what's happening and trying not to panic and building consensus through ongoing discussion and keeping in mind the principles that matter the most. So to me, those principles are that we must aim towards equality, that we must, it must be transformative where we're ultimately going. Yeah. And we need to, match those skills to play with places to go.
All right, gentlemen, I just want to bring in another question here, which is unrelated to COVID-19, and I hope that each of you would be able to just weigh in on it. On the issue of the right to education versus the right for schools to have certain policies pertaining to people who are unable to pay school fees and the right for children to be within those schools. Elijah Mhlanga, let me bring you in there. Let's talk about that right versus the right to education. The right to education rather versus these school policies that are in place?
Well, our mandate as the custodian of basic education in South Africa is to make sure that every learner has access to education, and the Schools Act comes to mind in that regard, that every learner must have access to school. That's why we are saying every learner between the age of 6 and 15 must be in school. Grade 1 and 9, those are compulsory school-going ages in South Africa, and as a result, we need to make sure that every learner who needs space in a school has access to a school, and we make sure that they get all the necessary support that they need for them to be able to continue with their education. So we don't turn any child away because so we need to make sure that we give access to all our children. Yeah. That's why out of our 25 schools, it's only a small number, maybe about 3,000, 4,000 that are asking for fees, but the rest do not.
Mr. Mhlanga, I want to bring in the independent schools at this particular point. I mean, you still have schools where, Mr. Montjane, where parents are unable to pay some of these school fees, and you read about a number of instances where they're chucked out of these schools.
Every child has a right to a basic education, and I think, as Mr. Mhlanga says, we as South Africa do not congratulate ourselves enough. We did achieve the Millennium Development Goals, in which basically every child in this country is in school. Independent schools have a right to exist based on the South African Constitution, but they must do so at their own expense. However, the Constitutional Court has just made a decision last month in AB versus Preparatory School that, in effect, all schools in South Africa offer a basic education, and there's duties, therefore, for all schools enrolling a child to offer a basic education. Independent schools, therefore, have to give due notice when parents are not able to pay school fees to assist those children to find alternative schools in which they can actually afford to attend. So, and I think that is something that's important, and I encourage parents to find a school that you can afford and is aligned.
But Mr. Montjane, that would kind of seem like, I'm
recommend
sorry, that would kind of seem like you're chucking out someone because they're unable to afford a basic right to education.
No, the full duty of basic education falls on the state, as Mr. Mhlanga says. So what we're only asking is that if parents cannot afford, please inform your school, and the school has a duty to actually try and find an alternative school for your child, and that also find something that you can afford. So we at ISASA say our members, you must give at least a term's notice or 3 months notice for you before you ask a child to leave, and also help that family find a school that they can afford. And public schools have no fee schools, and those public schools are there available. And if you can't afford it, there's a process where you apply to inform that school that you're not able to afford fees. That is one of the great things about South Africa, that every child can attend a school, and our government actually makes sure that that can happen.
All right, gentlemen, I'm afraid lots more to discuss, but we've run out of time. Lebogang Montjane there, the Executive Director of Independent Schools Association of Southern Africa, ISASA, Elijah Mhlanga, spokesperson for the Department of Basic Education, and Dr. Michael Gastrow, Chief Research Specialist, Education and Skills Development at the Human Sciences Research Council.